Violence in today's world is growing and expanding in all areas, generating an atmosphere of fear, uncertainty, asphyxiation, and claustrophobia. We experience not only the physical violence of war and crime, but also economic, racial, religious, psychological, domestic, family, and internal violence. We may have heard the word non-violence, but due to a lack of information, we don't always have a clear idea of what non-violence is. Non-violence is not pacifism, and it isn't just a simple methodology for marches and other actions. More importantly, non-violence is not the resigned attitude of those who avoid conflict out of fear. Non-violence is a great life philosophy and method for taking action. It has always been inspired by deep moral and religious convictions, and today it is the only coherent answer to the spiral of violence surrounding us. Let us briefly review what has been said about non-violence and the movements inspired by it.
Jainism, together with Hinduism and Buddhism, is one of India's religions. In Jainism, each living being contains a unique and immortal vital principle. Each act is itself a cause which produces an effect, and therefore each violent action, or himsa, committed against this vital principle will strike back against the one who is committing violence. Only through non-violent action is it possible to reach a place of bliss and peace. For this reason, ahimsa, non-violence, is the foundation of Jainist ethics. Ahimsa is total respect for every form of life.
Killing a living being is like killing oneself. To show compassion towards a living being is like showing it to oneself. Knowing this principle of equality, always treat others with respect and compassion.
Tolstoy was born in 1828 at Yasnaya Polyana in Russia. Between 1860 and 1880, he wrote his two most famous novels, War and Peace and Anna Karenina. But it is in his other books, such as The Kingdom of God is Inside You, where we find his deep reflections on nonviolence. After a spiritual crisis, he came to Christianity, trying to grasp its original and genuine sense, which had been lost in the official religion. According to Tolstoy, the Church has forgotten the two simple, essential principles of the Gospel: loving humanity and not opposing evil with violence. Therefore, even though Christianity is everywhere around us, it has not entered the hearts and lives of men.
And Christ taught at that time his doctrine, which consisted not only in the fact that one must not oppose himself to evil with violence, but also with a new concept of life, whose application to social life would have resulted in making fighting among men disappear, not by submitting some of them to certain authorities, but forbidding men, especially those in power, to use violence against anyone, no matter what the situation.
However, this message was really accepted only by a few, and when states welcomed Christianity, they did so by accepting only the surface of the doctrine, out of pure utility.
The contradiction between conscience and life, and therefore the split in two of our existence, has reached its extreme limit.
On the one hand, we speak of humanity, understanding, and justice, and at the same time we silently or explicitly support a society founded on violence. Whoever is in government always uses violence when his power is threatened. War is therefore justified as a need to keep the evil from reaching power, but those practicing war are the violent ones, and all they want to do is to protect their apparently advantageous situation. And so they will use public opinion to convince others that they are only using violence against an objective evil which puts everyone in danger. If we were not blinded by hypocrisy, the simple things in life would be really and truly clear to us.
Share what you have with others. Do not accumulate richness. Do not become arrogant. Do not steal. Do not cause suffering. Do not kill. Do not do to others what you wouldn't like to have done to yourself. This has all been said not 18 centuries, but 5,000 years ago, and there could be no doubt on the truth of this law if hypocrisy did not exist. The only meaning of life is to serve humanity, concurring to the institution of God's kingdom, which cannot be done if each man does not recognize and profess the truth. God's kingdom will not come in a way that can be observed, and it will not be said, "Here it is," or "There it is," due to the fact that the kingdom of God is within you.
Gandhi was born in India in 1869. He moved to London in 1888 to get his law degree. His interests brought him to study religious texts, and he discovered Tolstoy's thought and was especially struck by The Kingdom of God is Within You, which he defined as one of the few works capable of immediately transforming someone. In 1893, he went to the South African Union for work. In South Africa, power lay in the hands of a minority of whites, and there was a regime of absolute apartheid which discriminated not only against the natives, but also a small community of Indians. This is where Gandhi, faced with racial segregation and suffering from various offenses, started his social work. The Indian community was forced to face all kinds of injustice, persecution, disproportionate taxes, restrictions on personal freedom. Gandhi became the leader of this community, and in the beginning his battles were based on petitions, reprimands, publications, and letters. However, with the worsening of events, he matured and deepened his ideas and fighting methods. In 1906, a new law forced Asians to wear IDs, to have their fingerprints taken, and to submit to a series of humiliations. Gandhi launched a campaign of civil disobedience, and the Indians refused to register. The prisons became full, and Gandhi himself had his first experience in what he called Her Majesty's hotels. In 1913, most of the discriminatory laws were repealed, and Gandhi won his first great victory, proving the efficacy of nonviolence. In 1914, he returned to India, where he had, in the meantime, become famous. India was a very important British colony. It was militarily, politically, and economically subjected to the British. The British exploited India's natural resources, making great profits, but the country remained poor. Discontent was widespread throughout the country, and the Indian Congress had no political power of any kind. Thanks to Gandhi's leadership, the Congress acquired a different role in what became the process of Indian independence. The Muslim component became a part of it, and most importantly, it changed from an elitist movement to a mass movement. Nonviolent campaigns launched by Gandhi, which he called Satyagraha, that is, the force of truth, were supported in the whole country. Disobedience to unjust laws, demonstrations, and especially non-collaboration with the English government were practiced. Government schools were emptied, conflicts were solved outside the courts, whoever had administrative jobs left them, and English products underwent a boycott. Old Indian looms were dusted off to produce clothing, and thus, by not buying from the English, the colonizers were hit where it was most important to them, the economy. According to Gandhi, nonviolence
does not mean obedient submission to the will of the evil, but it means the use of all of the soul's powers against the will of the tyrant. Non-violence is not an excuse for the coward, but is the supreme virtue of the brave. The practice of non-violence needs much more courage than the practice of arms. Vengeance is a symbol of weakness as well. A dog barks and bites when it is scared. A man who is afraid of no one in the world deems it useless to even get angry with those who try, in vain, to offend him.
I regard myself as a soldier, though a soldier of peace. I know the value of discipline and truth.
The battle continued with the boycott of salt imported from England. Gandhi taught his people how to extract it from the sea. However, the path was not straight. There was great violence by the English, who in a sadly famous episode shot on the Pacific and defenseless crowds. And there was violence by the marchers, which made Gandhi stop the satyagraha and later restart the fight. In general, the English responded with a succession of concessions and repression. According to Gandhi, non-violence was much more than a form of battle or a means to reach political ends. Non-violence is battle against injustice, affirmation of love for others, search for the truth. A long experience has convinced me that there is no other God than truth. The small and flighty sparks of truth which I was able to gather could hardly give the idea of truth's splendor, 1,000,000 times more intense than that of the sun we see every day with our own eyes. In reality, what I have gathered is simply the lightest ray in that powerful glaze. However, based on all my experience, I can say with conviction that a perfect vision of the truth can only derive from a complete realization of ahimsa, of non-violence.
This difficult path brought India, at the end of the Second World War, to independence. It was not the independence which Gandhi had dreamed of. The country divided itself into Pakistan with a Muslim majority and the Indian Union with a Hindu majority. In precisely this atmosphere of religious violence, Gandhi was killed by a Hindu extremist in 1948. However, he had already shown the world the great power of ahimsa, the great power of nonviolent struggle.
Wade in the water, come on and wade.
Martin Luther King was born in 1929 in Atlanta, Georgia, in the United States of America. He graduated in theology and philosophy, and during his studies he discovered Gandhi, becoming touched and fascinated by the idea of nonviolence. A Baptist minister, he was more than a thinker. He was a great man of action. His social activity took place in the 50s and 60s, years during which, in the democratic United States of America, a very harsh segregationist regime was in place, a regime which pushed black people to the bottom of society. In all public places, including transportation, there were segregated areas for blacks. Their salaries were less, they did not have the same rights as white people, and they were surrounded by a venomous atmosphere of violence and discrimination, mostly relegated to living in ghettos. In 1954, Martin Luther King moved to Montgomery in Alabama. There he began his political activity, becoming a leader in the protest movement against racial segregation in the city's transportation system. Protest sparks began after Mrs. Rosa Parks was arrested for sitting down in a bus in a place reserved for whites and refusing to stand up. A successful boycott of transportation was then carried out. The protest lasted for more than a year, and the blacks of Montgomery displayed great conviction, stability, and maturity, putting Martin Luther King's ideas into practice, nonviolence, not responding to provocation. And there were all sorts of provocations. Martin Luther King was arrested and sentenced. He was threatened and attempts were made on his life. Mass arrests were executed. False information was given to the authorities and the media to try to divide the movement.
This is the way that we will get out of this dark night of oppression and make of this nation a better nation. It means that we can stand up, allow the opposition to know that we will not accept injustice. We will stand up against it with our lives, but we will never stoop down to the level of violence and hatred. And we will come to that point when we will be able to convince him that a new world is emerging.
After a year of protests, the Supreme Court declared segregation in transportation illegal. There were strong, violent reactions to the Supreme Court ruling, including protests by the Ku Klux Klan, but the movement's responses were also firm.
We feel also that one of the great glories of American democracy is that we have the right to protest far right. This is a non-violent protest. We are depending on moral and spiritual forces, using the method of passive resistance. Even if we have to receive violence, we will not return violence.
The black movement had grown among students as well. Non-collaboration, protests, and sit-ins were the methods most often used against segregation. An important goal was obtaining real voting rights for the black population. Martin Luther King continued to be abused, arrested without cause, threatened, and put in danger. Negotiations finally began, and the first agreements were made to abolish segregation. The struggle spread to the northern states, climaxing in the March on Washington of 1964, where Martin Luther King made his famous speech, "I Have a Dream."
I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day, even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
In the following years, during the continuing struggle, the reaction of segregationists worsened, and various leaders of the nonviolent movement died. Martin Luther King understood more and more deeply how his struggle was not just the struggle of blacks in America, but that of all humankind. He also understood that violence was to be found in society itself, in its rules and philosophy.
We're free from sorrow.
This depth of understanding led him to take a stand against the war in Vietnam and be criticized by the allegedly democratic Christian world, which was slowly beginning to accept and recognize him as a spokesman.
God is not interested merely in the freedom of black men and brown men and yellow men, but God is interested in the freedom of the whole human race and the creation of a society where all men will live together as brothers. No, we need not hate. We need not use violence. That is another way. And as modern as Gandhi saying through Thoreau, non-cooperation with evil is as much a moral obligation as is cooperation with good. That is another way.
Martin Luther King was assassinated on April 4th, 1968 in Memphis, Tennessee, but nothing could ever stop what he started. The day before, he gave a speech.
Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
Silo, the literary pseudonym of Mario Rodriguez Cobo, was born in Mendoza, Argentina in 1938, where he presently lives. His first attempts to make his ideas public were repressed by the cruel military regime which had imposed itself in Argentina in the 1960s. Silo and some of the young persons who diffused his ideas were arrested and persecuted. Only in 1969 did it become possible for him to make a public speech at an altitude of 3,000 meters on Aconcagua Mountain, surrounded by military vehicles and machine guns.
No creas que hablo de violencia, refiriéndome solamente al hecho armado de la guerra, es de violencia física. Hay una violencia económica. La violencia económica es aquella que te hace explotar a otro. La violencia económica se da cuando robas a otro. Cuando ya no eres hermano del otro, sino que eres ave de rapiña para tu hermano. Hay además una violencia racial. ¿Crees que no ejercitas la violencia cuando persigues a otro que es de una raza diferente a la tuya? ¿Crees que no ejerces violencia cuando lo difamas por ser de una raza diferente a la tuya? Hay una violencia religiosa.
Repression and media silence notwithstanding, Silo's thought spread from Latin America to the rest of the planet. In meetings and conferences carried out in various countries and continents, he publicly explained his ideas.
Nuestra moral se basa en este principio. Trata a los demás como quieres que te traten.
Many young people were enthusiastic about his proposals, and slowly a current of thought and action known as the Humanist movement began to grow. Silo's philosophy has been defined as New Humanism or Universalistic Humanism. His proposals do not target conflicts and injustice faced by only one specific culture, but the entire planet, where people in all latitudes suffer because of the violence of a minority which dominates and imposes its inhuman model.
En primer lugar, la llamada globalización no es sino la extensión de la influencia del imperio yanqui que día a día va imponiendo sus parámetros.
Diversity is very important. It is the richness of humanity.
Converger en una dirección hacia la nación humana universal.
The movement is called Humanism because the essential preoccupation of Silo's thought was human life, actual, real human beings.
Que todo ser humano tiene derecho a preguntarse por el sentido de la vida, por el amor, por la amistad, por todo aquello que hace a la poesía y la grandeza de la existencia humana. Y que una estúpida y pequeña cultura materialista trata de denigrar arrastrando todo hacia los antivalores y la desintegración.
In the 1990s, the humanist movement reached its full development. Today it fights for the real defense of human rights in society, politics, and culture in different regions of the planet.
Estas propuestas de considerar al ser humano como valor central, de propiciar la igualdad de oportunidades para todos, de reconocer la diversidad oponiéndose a toda discriminación, de auspiciar la libertad de pensamiento y de luchar contra toda forma de violencia, caracterizan nuestro pensamiento y nuestra acción en los aspectos más generales. Al mismo tiempo, estas propuestas terminan configurando un estilo de vida y un modo de relación del más alto valor moral que puede expresarse en esta frase: trata a los demás como quieres que te traten.
Silo's literary production is intense. He has published many books where his ideas are stated. In 1999, at the same place where, 30 years before, he had made his first speech, Silo declared the failure of the ideals of New Humanism, which could not be carried out.
Si hoy tenemos que declarar nuestro fracaso, también tenemos que anunciar a una nueva civilización que está naciendo. La primera civilización planetaria de la historia humana.
5 years later, during the first celebration of Silo's message, he explains,
hemos fracasado, pero insistimos. Hemos fracasado, pero insistimos en nuestro proyecto de humanización del mundo. Hemos fracasado y seguiremos fracasando, una y mil veces, porque montamos en alas de un pájaro llamado intento, que vuela sobre las frustraciones, las debilidades y las pequeñeces. Este es el intento que vale la pena vivir, porque es la continuación de las mejores aspiraciones de la gente buena que nos ha precedido. Es el intento que vale la pena vivir, porque es el antecedente de las futuras generaciones que transformará al mundo.
In a world where the lack of prospects for the future chokes the present, Silo clearly states his analysis and proposals.
En este desgraciado mundo en que la fuerza y la injusticia se enseñorea por campos y ciudades, ¿cómo es que se piensa acabar con la violencia? ¿Cómo es que se piensa acabar con la violencia? Tal vez piensen que son un ejemplo inspirador de las nuevas generaciones, cuando disfrazados de videojuego despotrican contra el mundo, cuando amenazan en la peor muestra de matonaje, cuando finalmente envían a sus muchachos a invadir, a matar y a morir en tierras lejanas. Este no es un buen camino ni un buen ejemplo. Trabajaremos a partir de hoy en todas partes del mundo para presionar a los que deciden, para difundir los ideales de paz en base a la metodología de la no violencia, para preparar el camino de los nuevos tiempos. Sí, vale la pena que este mensaje y este humanismo universalista cobren fuerza. Vale la pena.
Silo's message inspires a deep religiosity.
Finalmente, amigos, yo quisiera compartir con todos esta certeza profunda que dice: lo sagrado está en nosotros. Y nada malo puede ocurrir con esta búsqueda de lo profundo y lo innombrable. Yo quisiera, amigos, que se escuchara el mensaje de lo profundo. No es un mensaje estridente, es un mensaje muy quedo, que no se puede escuchar cuando se lo quiere atrapar. Yo quisiera, amigos, transmitir la certeza de la inmortalidad. Pero ¿cómo podría lo mortal generar algo inmortal? Tal vez deberíamos preguntarnos sobre cómo es posible que lo inmortal genere la ilusión de la mortalidad.
It's hard to say what future developments will be for Sila's message.
There have been many persons in history who have given hope to humanity, always showing non-violence as the path to be taken. They also show us how true power is inside the people when they fight for a better future with unity, solidarity, and firmness. They also show that inside each one of us there are kindness, strength, and wisdom, the only things we really need. Our future depends on the choices we make today.